All right. Welcome everyone. This is a hangout about um, my view about MVC and MV whatever style frameworks. I'm going to speak about why I think most people get MVC wrong and what's the right way of doing it. All right. So MVC in general is a paradigm, meaning it's not a pattern, it's not a, I don't know, it's not a framework. A framework can't implement MVC for that matter. MVC is just a way of structuring your code um, so that the separation of concerns is maintained. What does this mean? MVC, or MV whatever really, is the separation of your application into three distinct layers. A layer is, you can say it's a space where all your code lives, where classes are written and whatnot. A layer isn't any specific class or even a group of classes. Um, it's like HTTP sits on top of TCP/IP, and they're both completely separate layers. Each has their own implementation and concepts, but they're completely separate from one another. So MVC separates our application into three layers. The C, which is the controller or the presenter or whatever, which basically which handles the input from the user. Now, controllers come in many shapes. It could be a GUI controller, it could be a web controller, it could be a command line controller, it could be anything that basically handles input from the user. The view is what handles the output. It it has the logic that determines how to present the data back to the user, how to render it. Like controllers, views come in many forms. A view can update a GUI, a view can render an HTML document, or just display output for that matter. It's important to make the distinction between a view and a template. A view is not a template, and template isn't a view. Part of the view's job is to select the correct template and render it. And there's a big part, which is the M, the model. I'll repeat what I said earlier. The model is a layer. A model is not a class. There's no such thing as a model class, at least not in the classical MVC sense. A model is a layer that basically holds all of your application logic, right? All the heavy lifting, what's called the business logic, is described in the model, right? That includes all database operations, of course, but also all the processing, all the business validation rules, all of those things, right? It goes beyond just simple database interactions. Now, you often see different ORMs that call their classes models. You instantiate this model based on that table. And I think that's misguided, because a model is this huge layer where all of your code lives, right? So I'm
Can
going.
I chime in?
What?
The way I view the model is that that's where your application actually is. The controller is managing the information that goes to and from the model, your actual application, into the view. Like you separate the actual GUI of the application uh, into the view, and then you have the control that's just managing the data transfer in between the two. The view does not know anything about the application, and the application does not know anything about the view. And this makes it very easy to keep both a desktop GUI if you want to. You could have a mobile GUI if you want to, and you can also have a web applications if you want to. That's the thing that's kind of great about the MVC model.
Right. So basically, what Jem says is that the model is basically your application, and you can apply that same application to different types of controls and views. So you can have a large application that handles database, and you can have a web controller so you can access that database from a REST API of some sort, but also have a command line controller where you can SSH into the server and invoke it directly via an executable. And it will perform the same actions with the same code, with the same model code. That's the point. So how is it done? All right, that's the concept. But the way it's done is you have what's called a bootstrap stage, all right, where you instantiate your controllers and your views, and what basically happens is that you invoke the correct controller in some sort, and that's where a framework usually comes in and helps you. And the controller invokes code from the model layer. The basic idea is that the model is persistent, and your controllers make changes to the model, and the view queries the model for information. Right? So for instance, I want to implement a login solution. All right, so I have my controller that listens to HTTP requests for the login page, um, and once a request is posted to the controller will call um, for the lack of a better term, a service that handles authentication against the database, right? And that service um, is responsible for hashing the password and fetching the user from the database uh, through some sort of data mapper or DAO or whatever, and compare the result. And then at a later point, the view asks the model whether or not the user is authenticated, and then act accordingly. Either show the user a thank you page or redirect back to the index page, and or on the opposite side, you can show the login form with an error in case the model returned that the logging failed. Right? So, any questions about this? All right.
Good question. Is Francis even actually here, or is he just quiet? Oh yeah.
Well, the view, there are a couple of ways to do this. Um, one of the most common ways, and that's the way Spring does it as well, is for the controller to return the name of the view, or to return the class of the view, at which point someone higher up the chain, at the bootstrap level, instantiates that, right? So the controller can determine which view is called, or usually the way I used to do it, I didn't do it in Java, I used to do it in PHP. The way I did it with PHP was to have a one-to-one relationship between controllers and views. So you always get the view whose name is similar to the controller. So you had login controller and login view. So when someone invoked the login controller, that the same process would also invoke the login view. Right? Now PHP is a little tricky because PHP doesn't have persistent memory. Right? So basically in PHP the workflow is a bit different. You instantiate the controller makes changes to to the model, right? But first the model needs to construct the entire object graph from storage. Then you make a change. Then the view makes its query, and then you need to store all of the uh, object graph back into storage because there is no persistent memory here. In Java and in Node.js, the view basically persists throughout the entire runtime of the application, throughout the life cycle. So you make changes to the model, and the model will persist the changes whenever it feels like it, basically. But the application can keep running without storage per se. You can even, if you wanted, you can have storage done only on graceful shutdown. Of course, that's an extremely bad practice because if your application crashes, you're screwed. But you can do that, right? So yeah, the view is invoked by someone who manages all of these by a layer above your model view and controller. I hope that's clear.
The way I was taught MVC is that it's the best practice is if the view has no idea what the model is and the model has no idea what the actual view is. And you can actually make so that the view can query straight to the model. But the way I was taught is that that's a very bad practice because then you have to, it's not as exchangeable as it could be because then the view has to know of the model.
All right, let's again, by querying the model, I don't mean the view needs to instantiate a database connection or whatever. The view is comprised.
Excuse me. It's more of a you can make the view communicate straight with your application in general, but that's bad practice. I'm still thinking about what Francis said, and it doesn't, you can make the model be queried by the view, but you want to have that kind of communication controlled by the controller because it makes it easier if you want to change the view somehow in a way, and you won't have to deal with the model.
The view must be aware of. You can't have a complete separation here. Either the controller is aware of the view, or the view must be aware of the model. All right. I prefer the approach of the model being aware of the view being aware of the model, because the view can't exist without the model anyway, right? You can't really make the view reusable because the view is dependent on the model. But the model can be reusable. You can interchange controllers and views without actually making changes to the model, right?
Exactly.
And even more, you can take services like our login service, for instance, from the model and place it in another application as an independent library, and it'll work. It'll just work, right? So the main focus of MVC is about the M, right? The viewing controllers are less important here. It matters less how you instantiate them, right? The way Spring does it, for instance, you define a controller with an annotation, and Spring knows it's magically a controller, and then that controller returns the view class, right? And then Spring again magically invokes the view. But you know, it's a way. It's a way of doing it, and it enables clean. But it enables to do very cool things. But that means your controller is aware of the view, which sometimes isn't what you want, right? Sometimes you want the controller to be completely independent, and more often than not, a controller can be reusable, right? Because a controller calls a certain service. And if that service is a dependency and it's well defined as a dependency, you can easily reuse that controller. Because if we have the example of the login controller that needs the login service as a dependency, as long as you have the login service, you can reuse the login controller in multiple applications, right? Because you don't have to re-implement everything around it. You can just plop in the control, plop in the service, and then implement a view that fits your needs.
This sounds like a very web-oriented. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just. I worked with MVC both in Spring, and I worked with it when I did my Java FX project. And I think it's what you're saying is absolutely 100 correct, and that's why Spring kind of works in that way. I mean, technically, Spring doesn't just magically know things. It's made connections internally. You just tell it that this stuff is this stuff. So then Spring handles that stuff like it wants to handle that stuff, of course. But I'm getting off the point. The thing is that, like when you build a Java FX project, per standard, if you create an already made project, it happens that the actual view knows about the model in a way that's, when you work with Java FX, it's not very optimal. But when you work with it in web, it's just as you say. You want the controller to be reusable. For example, I'm using, in my web application I built, I'm using the same controller for certain things from two different pages or from two different views, because they're both going into the model and handling the cart, for example. Um,
Well, you have basically two options here. Um, the view needs information, right? Because it needs to. The view has logic that, based on that information, chooses what to do, whether it's including a template or updating a control or whatever, right? So it can get that information in one of two ways. Either the controller calls methods on the view, and that information is passed onto the view. Sorry, the controller calls method on the controllers, and then that information is passed from the controller to the view via method. Or the view can be independent from the controller and be aware of the model, right? Now, when I say be aware of the model, I don't mean that it has a dependency on it doesn't have to, be aware of all the objects and the stuff. The way I like to make my model is by splitting it into what I call services, for the lack of a better term. If you have a better term, please let me know. But basically what it means is that you have a service that is responsible for a task of some sort, be it authentication or handling emails, right? Or handling, I don't know, um, all sorts of tasks that your application has, and that service is what gets injected with dependency injection into the controller and view. All right. So your login controller has authentication service as an argument to the constructor, which is then injected somehow. Then the controller can call methods on that service to authenticate the user, right? So, for instance, I can think of two services um, one service, right? Now, inside the service, you have two more types of objects that can occur, right? You have your domain objects, which are objects that actually represent entities in your system, right? So in your applications case, in your car shop application task, you have person, right? And person is extended by customer and employee, and you have a vehicle, right? And the second type of object are the data mappers. Now, you can use JOOQ or any ORM. It doesn't really matter, right? The point of a data mapper is that it isn't bound specifically to database, right? It's a gateway between your domain objects and permanent storage. Permanent storage can be a database, it could be a file, it could be a REST API, it could be email, it could be null, all right? The idea is that your domain objects have no clue where they're coming from and where they're going. So a user object can persist both to the database but also to session, for instance, to keep the user logged in. That is all done in the service, right? So the authentication service has a method called login, which accepts a username and a password, right? Or an email and a password, whatever. So that method will now hash the password, or rather verify the pass. It will instantiate a user object, or in your case, an employee object, because those are the ones that can log in into the system. And it will instantiate the employee object, and it will call the user mapper dot get on that and pass in that new user object, new employee object, and that will grab the information about the user from the database and map it into the domain object, and then you compare the data between what the user gave and what the database has, and then you return, for instance, a Boolean on whether the username and whether the user is successfully authenticated or not. And all the controller sees is that login method that returns a Boolean. It doesn't care how things are implemented in the background. So, for instance, you can test this very easily by mocking the data mapper object, right? So you map to a known mock, for instance, and you get a deterministic result. And you can even, mock the entire service, and then you can test the controller. It's very easy to test it that way. And then after the login has been completed, the same method can be used, or a different method on the authentication service can be used to map the user object from the previous method. The same user object is now persisted with a different type of data mapper into session, right? Instead into more permanent storage. So now the same user object persists to two different locations, and it's still represented by the same object. That's a very big advantage, because I often see applications where there are 5 of the same Pojo, one for database and one for storage and one for session and one for internal stuff and another one in a static class, and that sucks, right? So I'm trying to find a good example of this.
Did you see my question?
Yeah, now I'm looking at it. Right. What I mean about the view being aware of the model, right? The view has has let's say I want to display the authentication result to the user, right? So now the view object has authentication service as a dependency, as an argument to the constructor. That's its connection with the model, right? So now the model can also call methods. The view can also call methods on a service that exists in the model layer. So now I can grab data from the model layer through getter methods on that service, right? So the view can now get user object from session, for instance, and then that method will go and ask the session mapper that it has in memory to grab the user that exists in session. So it will return the same user object that was created by the invocation from the controller. And then the view can use that user object to create, to grab the name of the user and display a hello message, to grab the whatever and, display stuff. Or it could grab the errors from the authentication and display those. Right? The point of the view is to hold the logic that determines what to display. I hope that was.
My question more or less regards, what you actually meant by how it's aware of it. I mean, if you have a view and you have a web shop and you want to display your items, of course the view is gonna know that you have items and it's gonna know how to display them. But I think I got a somewhat greater insight to it now.
If the view needs to display items, all right, from a catalog, for instance, so the view will have your catalog service as a dependency, and that catalog service has a get items for this user method or something similar to that, and the view will call that.
You won't put that method inside of the controller. You will have the view go directly into the model and get that. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay. And that's what I was taught was it was a bad practice. I mean, it's obviously not very extremely bad. I mean, if you have jQuery not jQuery, JavaScript in the view and you wanted to go fetch stuff, then it serves a very good purpose. It's just that I was taught that the view is pretty stupid. It's smarter than in other versions of the same concept, but it's still pretty stupid. It has its own logic, but it gets all of the information from the controller. That's what I was taught. And it shouldn't go directly into the model. It should go
But
to the
then
controller that
but
goes
then
into
your
the model.
controller does two things. It handles output, but then it also queries for data and passes it into the view.
Yes, and that's what I was taught that it was supposed to do.
Right.
It
But that's
handles
not the
that
separation of
communication.
concerns, right?
Mhm.
Because for all I know, why not just, have the controller select the template and return that?
And
Why
that's
not skip the
exactly
view altogether,
what it's been doing and what I've been taught to do. The controller,
right?
when you go to a page and you click, you send a request to the controller, which, okay, you want a request for this, and then it returns that model. It's the servlet that directs which controller is being invoked.
Right.
Um, so the controller is saying which view is going to be used, and the view can connect to the controller, and the view can check to the controller that's uh, applicable to what the view wants to do. Like if you have one controller that manages the data flow of the shop, like a shopping cart, for example, putting stuff in it and removing stuff from it, then the controller, I mean the view goes to that controller and gets that stuff done. But it could just as well go to another controller, like the like in the shopping page. Then the shopping page can both add to cart, and it can go and see what items are in the store. It can receive items from stores, and there are two different controllers for that particular thing.
Right. Well, um, the what this means is that your controller does a lot and your view does near nothing, right? The view shouldn't be used as a thin wrapper around theme leaf templates or whatnot. The view is a class with logic, right? And we want to separate concerns. The controller deals with input, the view deals with output, and the model deals with everything else, right? So the I like the idea of the model being aware of the I like the idea of the view being aware of the model better, right? Because that means that the controller isn't aware of the view, and the view isn't aware of the controller, right? It doesn't care. Um, so, like Francis said, this is similar to the MVP, paradigm, whatever. Note that I named this hangout MV star, like MV whatever, because they're all basically the same paradigm. The difference between C and P is an implementation
Pretty
detail.
much that the view is even dumber in MVP than it is in MVC, where MVC it can be, it actually is allowed to to contain stuff like JavaScript to perform all of the logic on the view. In MVP, it's just supposed to more or less only display stuff.
The view doesn't have JavaScript, right? The template might have JavaScript in it, but the view is the class that defines the logic in web context. For instance, the view contains the logic that determines, based on data from the model, which template to include, right? Be it the login form again and display errors, or redirect to the index page, or a thank you page, or maybe even a 500 error in case something bad
Yeah,
happens.
I think where I've had a misconception now. Thank you very much. You cleared up a few things for me just now.
Right. Um, we just know how to render data received injected to it by the controller. Yeah. So Um, in that case, what Itachi asked is whether the view just knows how to render data received or injected in it by the controller. Yeah, that's what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Um, the idea is that in that case, the controller is responsible both for handling input from the user and getting the data for the view, right? Which shouldn't really be the case, because then the controller does too much. Um, as for the view doing things, well, that's the point of the view, right? That's why you have that layer in. Otherwise, you could just, return templates from the controller and have someone higher up the chain just render those. You don't need the view, right? What do you have the view for, if not for doing that logic? Spring does a lot of things, right? Um, you can return early from a controller, return with an error. You can select the view class or the view name, right? Um, or um, you can have the configuration select the view for you based on the controller. To handle user events. Handling user events is actually done by the controller, not by the view. The view is responsible for output, not input. So I don't see where you're heading with this. All right, so let me ask you this. Say the user logs in, all right? So your presenter handles the login, right? Yeah, I mean, it it accepts the command. Um, how do you determine whether you want to display an error, move to the next screen, or error out or do nothing? Who determines that? The presenter? Well, in that case, I'd argue that the presenter does too many things, right? It handles the input and the output. That's, you know, kind of missing the point. The idea of separation of concerns is that your um, whatever handles only the input. It makes changes to your internal object graph that the model holds, and then the view makes decisions based on that information that's available in the model, right? So think about this large tree of objects that they interconnect, and they are aware of each other because the user holds a car and the car holds a model, a brand, and the user also is referenced by this other object or whatever. And then the user say I want to in Gems app I want to um, add a car to my to my to my data, to my storage, right? So there's this add car controller, or this car controller, which has add, remove, update, and delete methods on it. And that controller calls the car service, right? Or you can even go larger and say, um, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to model in real time, but that service is responsible for creating this new car object and then filling it with details that the controller gave me. Right? The controller is supposed to give the details and invoke a method in the model. Right? So it invokes create car license plate and passes in the license plate and the brand and the fuel type and the year and whatnot. And then the model, the service, creates a new object, puts it in the right place in memory, and then persists it to database. And only after that, the view is called, and the view requests, because at this point all you want to do is probably refresh the car list. So now the model will call get car list and display this new list. All right. In your way, the controller will call get car list, and then call new car view, and pass in that list. Right? In my opinion, that controller being aware of the view things is wrong. It's not right, because that makes the controller less reusable. It has more dependencies. So what's your way? How would you do it?
Although I just want to point out that your preference of what to use is not really an argument for the specific method we're describing. Like, I understand that you like MVP better, but that's not how MVC works. So,
Are you talking to me or to Francis?
Francis, yeah, because it seemed like I'm just saying this because this is how I understood it. He seemed to be arguing for MVP in a situation where it was, to me, not really relevant, because if you prefer MVP, it doesn't really matter to how MVC actually works. I just wanted to point out that that's how I perceived what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Itachi says that the model should return the control to the controller, and controller should render the page. Well, let me ask you this. In that case, what's the job of the view? Yeah. Yes and no. The string that you return is the name of the template, right? In this case, you kind of skip the view stage, right? The view is a layer between your application, the model and the controller, and the templates. Right. So in Spring's case, what you're referring to by returning a string, you're practically skipping the view layer and call the template layer directly from the controller. All right. That's good when you have simple cases. Not so good if you need some more control. All right. There is a thing called over abstraction. Right? When you abstract things you don't need to abstract. Like if your model, all your model does is always select the same template for every piece of data it receives, you probably don't need a view object. Right? That's over abstraction. I can create 10 layers between my controller and the view, and all each does is just call the layer below it. Right? But that's pointless. So if you have a relatively small and simple application, calling the template directly works. Right? The problem starts when you need more than that. Right? The problem starts when you need, let's say you want to call a simple car list template if you have 5 cars, or paginated car list if you have more than 5 cars. How do you deal with that? You'll have to do it in the controller, right? But then it means that the controller needs to know how many cars are there right now, which isn't the responsible of the controller. The controller only needs to add this new car into the memory cloud thingy, right?
So basically, all it needs to do is inject the data it receives. It just forwards information. That's all it
The
does.
the way I like to look at it is that the controller only ever calls setters on the model, and the view only ever calls getters on the model, right? That's the base of it, right? The controller doesn't need data unless it needs data for its own logic to determine what to do with the input it got, right? But that's relatively rare, right? Most of the getter logic where you need data to determine what to do is actually done in the view because that's what the view is for.
Do you know of any web application project that you could point us to, so well, at least I could have a look at it? Because I'm in desperate need of looking at properly done MVC web applications. Because I think that would teach me a lot just by looking at other people's code.
I don't have one in Java. I might have one in Node.js, but it's pretty high level. Um, I can try to look
It,
for it if you want.
yeah, you could. But to me, I'm more of a pattern kind of person. As long as the patterns are there, I can usually kind of piece the code together. I might not be able to replicate the code, but I can usually, I'm looking for the patterns. Um, I'm looking for patterns. As long as the patterns are there and they are clear, I can deduce them and I can discuss them.
All right. Um, so Itachi, I'll try to elevate some of your confusion. Um, disregarding how things are called, right? Because it changes based on context, and we don't really care how this specific controller is getting invoked. So basically, you have what happened? Huh. You have tell me if it's too small to see it. Is that alright? Let's just
It's fine for me.
uh, right. So we have our controller, right? And this controller, um, we have here the model layer. And the model layer includes our services. And these services include our domain objects and data mappers, right? The
Can I ask
services,
something?
yeah, sure.
The domain, this is something that's very relevant to my course. What is the domain object here?
Right. The domain object is the actual entity. All right. You can think of it as the physical objects. The physical objects. In your case, that would be employee and
So it's the
customer and
beans, kind of.
car. Right? What?
It's kind of like the beans for the objects.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, then it was what I thought it was, but no one had actually told me. So while we had it here, I just wanted to ask.
Yeah. Right. So we have this controller, and this controller is called by someone, and it will invoke methods on the model, or rather on the service that is passed. The controller will have, um, let's see, sure. The controller will have services as listed as dependencies. So um, public login controller needs authentication service of, right? Let's a little larger. All right. So this controller will invoke methods, setter methods, on the auth service, right? Methods that have side effects in this case. And after it's done, it will either return a view class, right? Or someone else will choose a view class. The implementation really varies, and it doesn't really matter in this case. But then you'll have this view, and the view will also invoke methods. Um, whoops, will also invoke methods on the on the um, on the model. Only in this case, it won't it won't change the model, but it will instead ask information from the model. And in this case, this view, which we want to be to know about the state of the authentication of the user, will also have the authentication service as a dependency, right? So it'll have a public login view, right? So there's not logic controller, but login controller, right? So in our particular case, let's do this. Our controller will have, let's say, a handle login method, and in Spring you'd come on. In Spring you'd use mapping, right? Something like this, slash login methods post, right? Or something like that. I don't remember the exact syntax, but it doesn't really matter. And handle login will receive the username and the password, right? And then it will basically call auth.authenticate or auth.login and pass username and password, and maybe wrap it in some sort of try-catch, right, or something like that. And at the end of the day, it will return either loginView.class, right, or maybe don't return anything and let the convention of both of them starting with the same, both of them having the same name, but this one having controller and this one having view or whatever, right? So the idea is that this only ever changes the it only ever changes the model, right? It doesn't get data. It doesn't have logic in it, right? So then the view will have this method called I don't know, get authentication status, right? Which will get called, or maybe some predetermined view called render, right? And this render will call auth dot get login status, and get login status will internally fetch the user from session or return null. So if user equals auth get whatever, and if user equals null, then display form again with an error, right? And I can use auth get errors or whatever,
Is it really all that great to have, it send the view again? That sounds like unnecessary data transfer.
It's necessary um, for the separation, right? Because in this case, I may want the user data. In another case, I may not need it, right? The idea is that the controller doesn't know this. It doesn't know what the view needs. It shouldn't know, because then the controller is dependent on both the model and the.
No, I meant the part where you just send the same page again. I meant that sounds like unnecessary data transfer. And I meant,
Uh,
like, won't you just display it so that instead of giving the entire page, it just displays an error message?
well, usually you'd want some sort of, usually I'd um, have the login form, right? If we're talking about a web context, you'd have the login form, and the login form would submit a post request to login via Ajax, and then the response from the view wouldn't be to include the page again. It would be some sort of JSON response.
Yeah,
Which is
that's what
the
I was
error.
thinking, that you update the current page, you don't send the entire page again.
Right. But the idea is you can, right? The
Yeah, of course.
view
Okay, I was just
can
wondering
do
if that's
whatever. And sometimes, you're dealing with browsers that don't support JavaScript or don't support Ajax, or you're dealing with crawlers, or I don't know, all sorts of wacky stuff. And that's exactly where the view comes in. You can have that logic of whether the request came from Ajax or not in the view. Right? The view
okay.
has access to this auth object, but it also has access to the request and response objects in a web context. And so you can grab data from the request object and say, well, if request dot is Ajax, then in the response you'd want to serialize your errors and whatnot into JSON with some sort of library, and then response dot send that JSON string, right? But if it's not, you'd want to include a complete template and respond with an HTML page. All right.
Yeah, I understand. I was just wondering that if you have tools available, is it really that great of an idea to just send the entire page? I'm still, I've only made one web application, so I just want to see what I know and what you're saying, and if it's just, for example, or if it's actually a good practice, and why is it a good practice? So I actually
Yeah,
absolutely
in
love
this
your
in
answer.
this case, it's just an example. You're right. Um, to the best practice would be to handle both cases, right? And how can you handle both cases? Well,
Yeah,
render
yeah.
would be called with the request.
Yeah, you've already answered me.
Response.
You've already answered me everything I needed to know.
Right.
I absolutely loved your explanation. I just
Now
wanted to
the
explain why
good
I was asking.
thing, I'll stall on this little implementation detail. The good thing about HTTP is that it has that functionality built in, right? You pass when you request when you request a page with HTTP, or you request a resource with HTTP, you define the accept header, right? And this accept header, let's let's put it here. You accept x/html, for instance, right? So this header will be available through this request object, and it defines what kind of responses the client accepts, right?
Yeah, I know this part. You don't have to explain it to me. If
Right.
the other guys want to know about it, then that's, I'm just saying that you don't have to explain anything else now, because your answer already answered everything I needed to know.
All right. Awesome. Um, so this model layer, sorry, is persistent in memory. right? And it's up to the data mappers to persist this data into more permanent storage, right? Because probably you would want to persist as soon as possible, because you don't want that if your application crashes for some reason that you'll lose data. Um, so in most cases, like when you add a car, you'd call the car service dot add car with the details, and the car service will create a new domain object, right? A new POJO, fill in the details, and then call datamapper dot save and pass in that object, right? So your domain object is not aware that it's being persisted. It's not aware of where it's stored. It's not even aware of where it arrived from, right? It could be instantiated because of user input, because of database storage, because of whatever. And the data mapper is aware of the database and the domain object, right? The data mapper or the data mapper factory, for instance, holds either a database connection um, or a connection strings or a URL or whatever, and it's responsible from doing the direct mapping, right? So it's an important point to make. You have, on an average application, you have a lot of data mappers, right? Because you want the user object to be persisted to both database and session, for instance. So you have two data mappers for one domain object. And that's just two, right? You may want to persist to database, to storage, to a file, to log, to null in a test, right? Into a mock, I don't know, whatever. So you can easily reach 4 or 5 data mappers per domain object. So that's a lot of classes, but it's okay because each has their own responsibility. This class's responsibility is to map between the database and the user object, and that class's responsibility is to map between the user's cart and the session storage or whatever, right? So
Is that
that's
where
the
you put the
responsibility.
logic for like when you are gonna get the statistics data? Do they have that kind of responsibilities as well?
I did catch the question again, please.
Um, like for statistics in my car shop, is it this area that also contains the logic for when you want to map certain data from different tables too, or is it only when you deal with the actual domain objects?
Well, the model only knows domain objects, right? It doesn't know how data is formatted, nor does it care. It's the view's job to get all the data it needs, serialize it, and then call the template you want with the serialized data. Alternatively, you can
What
serialize the data.
I mean the data mappers. Are they the ones who maps? They only map to the domain objects. They don't map anything else. Only the
Right.
domain
Data
objects.
mapper is only
Okay,
aware
then I
of
got
the storage it maps to and the domain object it maps. Right now, data mapper the main difference between data mapper and ORM is that ORM is very table centric, right? You have one
Okay,
class
for
per
the people,
table.
I'm actually wondering about it. It is the ORM. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the ORM, for the rest of the people, the ORM is very table-centric. You have one ORM per table and one domain object per table. And in this case, no, you don't, right? The data mapper, the domain object is a logical entity of your application. It's not an entity of your database, right? In GEM's example, the database the entities in the database involve vehicle and brand, and even fuel type is an entity because it has its own table. And in here, you don't need its own entity for that, right? So that's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
responsibility of the
something like
data
that.
mapper to
Yeah,
know all these things and map to the correct data.
Yeah, like you make an object like the car. It only it has everything that the car needs to have. I think this is where I had some issues when I was designing my tables because I thought too much of the car, as a complete object would fit into an entire table. That's what I think
Yeah,
that's where I had my issues. So
right.
so
So
the
data
object,
mapper is like two in one. It's an ORM, but it's also a mapper, right? Or
yeah.
a decorator.
Yeah, it gets the relevant data that needs to be inside of the entity from the tables where they are at. And then the domain object can have data from several tables.
Right. Now, the good thing about this is that the main object can have not only data from multiple tables, but it can have data from multiple tables and also data from user input, right? Because if you want
Hmm.
to update car, you'd grab the data from the database, then you replace data with user input, and then persist, and then save, right? That's the point. So now you have the same domain object with data from two different sources that maps back to the database. Right. Any further questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you are trying to say over here is that we get the controller gets the control from the HTML pages, and the
The controller
control.
gets control from, for instance, in web context, from the servlet
Hmm,
container, right? The servlet
yes,
will call controller.
correct. Uh, and the servlet gets a control from the page.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then we forward this control to the model layer. So how come the control is not reverted back to the controller and forwarded to the view?
Right. So let's see the implementation of servlets, right? So this is the servlet or the servlet container. I'm not sure how Java does things, right? It's the level above your application, right? Servlet container. So servlet container does logic that calls some controller,
Correct.
right? And if you choose to do this, you can have class of view as the result from, yeah, not like this. Hold on. Um, this is like controller equals new some controller based on logic, right? And then controller um, call the action you want, be it in our case the handle login action, but it calls the
Mm.
action, and the action can return a view class, right? In this
So
case,
the view is returned from the controller.
yeah, you can do that, or you can some logic can return, not exactly return, but infer some name, right? Login, right? And then you call login controller, and then you call login view, right? The objects that start with login. This is a bit more magical, but it also ensures that the view and the controllers are not aware of each other. In this case, you still have a minimal interaction between controller and view, which
Mhm.
could be a good thing. Sometimes you need that control. Sometimes you want the controller to be able to select the view. It's alright. It's a good thing. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't need to.
Uh,
Sometimes
the part I the part I don't understand is when we don't need the controller to render the view.
well, when would you need the controller to select the view? All right, because when you think about it, login controller is likely to always call login view, right? So why return login view anyway? Why not infer that on a higher level and remove the dependency between the two?
Now, login controller.
At this point, login controller must be aware of login view, right?
Correct.
Sometimes that's, not optimal. Sometimes you'd want the view to be completely separate from the login, from the controller. Sometimes, however, you wouldn't, right? Sometimes you want the controller to return an error in case there was an exception, right? So here you'd go catch, like a SQL exception E, and here you'd return error view dot class, right? Notice how the main point here is that the controller only returns the name of the view. It doesn't pass any data to the view. It's up to the view to determine why it was called and what is required of it, right? So the error view is likely to have a dependency on error service, right? And the error service will know, based on the previous interactions, what were the errors in the application, and it will know that I had an SQL exception and infer that database is down, right? And return an error 500 and with the proper template and whatnot, and say, I'm sorry, the database is down, please try again later. Right? In this case, you do want the controller to be aware of the view. Yeah. In some cases, you can just instantiate the controller that's named login controller, and then instantiate the view named login view, and be done with it. Sometimes, like I said, you can skip the view altogether by returning a template instead of a view. Right? It doesn't really matter if you return a class or a string or whatnot. You return a template, right, instead of the view. And then you skip the view stage altogether. That's also possible. Right? The thing Spring often does is squash the template and view layer together. So your model, your template gets data from the model, right? In Spring, you often have this active model, or however it's called, I don't remember. But I think you have some sort of model object here, and then
Yeah,
you
it's a model
go
map.
right, and then you have model add username whatnot, right? And then this template can access username and get whatnot.
Correct.
Right, so this is sort of a mix between the view and the template layers, which is, again, could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, depends on the amount of control you need. Sometimes you want the view to be able to select the template itself, the view object, to determine based on logic whether you want to display this template or another. The best example is you'd want to check the request accepts contains x/html, and if that's true, then I want to include HTML templates. Or else, if rec accepts contains patient/JSON, you want to serialize data to JSON and send that, right? So it all depends on your needs. You know, you have a control over how many layers you put in your application. Each layer should have its own purpose. Sometimes that purpose is overkill, right? You won't, like, it's just like you won't need MVC for every application. For the simpler applications, that would be overkill because it's too many layers. So the same applies here, right? You can have your controller control which view is instantiated, and you can have your view control which template is instantiated. It all depends on the amount of control you want.
So basically in Spring MVC, the view and the template is sandwiched to form a single layer.
Correct. Correct.
Oh, okay.
Right. Spring simplifies things for you in a lot of ways. In this particular case, you kind of lose control, and if you don't want to lose that control, then your controller has to do too many things, which I didn't like.
Yeah, whatever you are saying is done in the view part, we used to do in the controller part.
Right. So in Spring, this logic here would have to go in the controller, which kind of
Yes, correct.
sucks, right?
Ah.
Because that's presentation logic. It's not, it has nothing to do with the actual action of logging in.
Correct.
Any more questions?
I just think it sounds like Spring is doing more MVP than MVC.
Again, I'm not particularly, familiar with the differences, but from what I get, the difference between MVP and MVC is an implementation detail, not a conceptual detail. The basic idea is still the same, right? View handles output, presenter or controller handles input, and model handles everything else. So that's the concept of it.
Yeah, the way I understood MVP is that the presenter is just, it doesn't do any more logic than just show stuff. That's the understanding I got.
Mm-hmm.
I may be wrong. I mean, that's just what I understood from what I've been reading.
Francis, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have anything to say?
He left us a while ago.
Yeah.
Oh, he left. Oh, I didn't see that. Oh well. Any further questions? If not, we'll end.
I have lots of questions, but not on this topic.
Alright, so let's save it to chat. Itachi, is everything clear for you?
Yeah, almost. I'll have to go through a few documents, but yeah, I understand what it is.
Alright then. So thank you everyone for coming, and we will stop the broadcasting here. If you guys have more questions, you know where to find me, and have a good one.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.